Former Labour Cabinet Minister Alan Milburn has quit the government's Social Mobility Commission, saying that Theresa May lacks the commitment to make Britain fairer. In his resignation letter, he warned of increasing anger and resentment thanks to 2 decades of lost wage growth, which is creating a breeding ground for populism. To discuss that and much more as well, we're joined now by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. Mr McDonnell, very good morning to you. Shall we start with Alan Milburn and what appears to be the demise of the Social Mobility Commission? I mean, what is your view in all of this? Do you recognise some truth in Mr Milburn's words that Brexit is the priority and not improving the lot of society as Theresa May promised on the doorstep of number 10?
It's important to know it's not just Alan that's resigned. It looks as though it's the whole Commission, and that's a cross-party resignation then. And I think he's right. Brexit is dominating the government agenda, but I just wonder if the budget was the last straw as well, because we were expecting quite a bit out of this budget in terms of, well, tackling the education cuts that people are experiencing at the moment. 5,000 head teachers wrote to the Prime Minister and asked them to halt the cuts, and that didn't happen. It's the same, really, investment in skills, and well, wage levels are so low now and predicted to stagnate for the next number of years as well. So I can understand the frustration that Brexit is dominating the agenda, but nothing else has moved either, not just because of Brexit, just because even in the budget they couldn't address the real issues.
Well, let's move on to your brief. And of course, you've been touring the city of late, speaking to bankers, speaking to fund managers, I mean, essentially going house to house, saying, Labour is your friend. Does that ever make you feel uncomfortable? No. Who picks up the tab for lunch?
No, well, I never take a free lunch. I never accept a lunch. It's usually cups of tea, and I pay for the tea. No, I've been doing this for 2 years now in this brief. So I've been meeting lots of people, both in the city, hedge fund managers, asset managers, but I've also been out on the shop floor as well, meeting workers themselves and management. I went to a tech fair the other week about robotics, issues like that. And it's trying to say, this is what we're trying to do, this is what our plans are, being completely open with people and taking their ideas on board as well.
But has the charm offensive been entirely successive? I mean, Morgan Stanley this week telling their investors that Jeremy Corbyn a bigger threat to business than Brexit, provoking this response from Mr Corbyn.
It's a growing movement of well over 500,000 members and a government in waiting that will work for the many. So when they say we're a threat, they're right. We're a threat to a damaging and failed system that's rigged for the few.
How does that help your case?
Let me just go back on. It's not a charm offensive. It is being absolutely straight with people. This is what our plans are. We want to listen to people to say, what's your view on that? And we'll take a lot of views on board as well, and we'll adjust our plans accordingly. Morgan Stanley, the reason Jeremy reacted that way, Morgan Stanley is an outlier. And to come out with the criticisms that they did was a bit shocking, because that's not the response we're getting at the moment. And remember as well, I have to make this point, Morgan Stanley have been contributing to the Conservative Party for quite a while, so they are supporters of our political opponents. I understand that, but I'm happy to sit down with Morgan Stanley and say, what are your genuine criticisms? Because I don't think they realise what we're about.
Well, look, I hope you've got your iPad somewhere about your passing, because I do want to get into the detail of your figures, examining the rationale of what is, one has to admit, a fairly striking economic policy portfolio. Can we start with corporation tax? Because there is a very clear difference between the government and the opposition. They say cut 2 points to 17%. You say raise by 7%. What's the thinking there?
Well, we believe at this point in time, and I wanted this to happen in this budget, you do not give tax giveaways to the corporations and the wealthy whilst your public services are suffering so badly. So you
could have said stay neutral at 19%, but your manifesto commitment is
what we said is we'll go back to, well, not even the level of the last Labour government. We'll go below that, and that still keep us competitive with the rest of Europe and America in particular. But what we're saying is we all have to pay our way in this situation, and we cannot stand. I just give this example. In this budget, what the government has done is given another $4.7 billion in tax cuts by reducing the bank levy to the bankers. Before the budget itself, charities and local government wrote to the Chancellor and said, The most vulnerable children in our society are at risk. We need $2 billion by 2020. Now's not the time to be giving tax cuts to the wealthy, the banks and the corporations.
We will get on to some of those topics in a bit more detail, but just focusing on corporation tax. I mean, you say that it would raise, roughly around £20 billion?
Over time.
Now, that does make sense. The Treasury says 1% would raise 2.7 billion. You multiply it, you factor in inflation, and you're roughly at 19.4 billion. But isn't that just a bit of a back of a fag packet calculation that assumes that there'll be no change to behaviour? At higher rates of tax, return on investment is reduced, meaning less investment, less growth, less take.
Two issues there. One is, if you look at the Grey Book, which I costed our manifesto, I published it in a Grey Book alongside. The Conservatives didn't, by the way. We also said we'd ensure that there was tax avoidance measures brought in to ensure that there was any change in behaviour around tax avoidance and tackle it. But I also put in, if you look at it, over $4 billion in terms of flexibility, so that we had a bit of a buffer in case not everything came in.
But the economic consensus is, yes, the corporation tax rise will raise money in the first year. After that, it gets a little bit dubious because of the changes in behaviour. And remember, we are coming out of the European Union. We are coming out of the European Union, raising corporation tax by 7%. And in what way does that make us more attractive?
Well, we're as competitive as we were before in terms of the relationship with the rest of Europe and America, because we're going nowhere near the rates elsewhere. So we'll still be competitive. But the great thing, you said there was a consensus about it. It's quite the reverse. We had large numbers. I think there was 130 economists who wrote in saying, actually, we support these plans.
Not the IFS, not the Institute of Business.
Well, no, actually, the IMF and others have actually said now's the time when you shouldn't be cutting taxes in this way and you should be investing.
But isn't it a fundamental that whenever we see a rise in corporation tax, it's people, not companies, that ultimately bear the burden? Either the company has wealth, which means shareholders lose out, the company increases its prices, consumers lose out, or wages are reduced, staff are laid off, the workforce loses out.
Well, what's interesting, if you look at what's happened, the government has cut corporation tax, and now we have corporations sitting on earned income of around about $590 billion, not investing. So actually the promotion of tax cuts to encourage investment hasn't worked. And what we need to do now, ensure we have a fair taxation system. We're not asking for the earth. We're asking simply them to pay their way a bit more.
Well, let's stick with tax, shall we, and turn to income tax. And your plans on that involve both cuts and rises, yes?
We said the top 5% will need to pay a bit more. And again, I think that's been generally recommended by most of the economic institutions, and you've got IMF, OECD and others, are saying we need fairer taxation systems now if we're going to afford our public services.
But isn't there a point at which you say, is there a point at which you say enough is enough? You're saying, we're just asking for a little bit extra. I mean, can you guarantee that you wouldn't go beyond 50%?
We've said that, because if you look at our manifesto, we said for only that top 5% would be increased, and we set out the levels. We were very clear on that, and we said for the remainder there would be no increase in income tax or VAT or national insurance.
But again, I mean, the costing, $6.4 billion is what you say would be raised from income tax, and that works out only if you just go to the spreadsheet and change the 45 to a 50. It assumes again no change in behaviour. And of course, top rate earners are going to be reducing their taxable income as a result of this. I mean, the figure is just not accurate.
Well, I'm afraid they are accurate, and they were tested. And if you look at what's been said in terms of the support we've had,
the tax revenue that Labour's proposal would raise is highly uncertain. If no one changed their behaviour in response, it would raise around $7 billion a year. Some of those affected would respond by reducing their taxable incomes. And that's why we put in there measures to ensure that we tackle tax avoidance and tax evasion, and we put a buffer in as well. The IFS disagreed with us just on that one point. If you look at other economists, they came out in our support. OK. In terms of the tax take post-Labour rises, we're talking, roughly $48.6 billion again. And again, the IFS challenged that estimate. They, in fact, came up with a figure of $41 billion, which in their view was a very generous estimate.
Well, it's interesting, because we looked at the IFS figures. They said there was about $9 billion difference. One of the things that they said
they said it was their $41 billion was a very generous estimate. So
with the greatest respect to the IFS, that was contested by large numbers of other institutions as well as economists. But if you look at what they were saying, for example, they were saying the property tax would not bring in a penny. That overseas companies owning properties in this country. They operate in Singapore, they operate in Canada, they operate across the world. So we pointed to them and we've said to the IFS, we'll have that dialogue with you. They also contested other matters. But actually, if you look at the buffer that I put in there was enough to tackle those issues. OK, so you don't recognise the IFS figures, at least on that very specific point? On some of the issues.
On that specific point, I'll concede. I mean, your own figures have a habit of changing pretty rapidly. Back in March, Rebecca Long-Bailey claimed that reversing Conservative changes to corporation tax, capital gains, inheritance tax and the bank levy would raise roughly £70 billion. That was in March. When you published your manifesto in May, those four measures plus scrapping the married person's tax allowance would raise £23.1 billion. I mean, even when you're using your own figures, they have a tendency to shift.
No, that's not true. The issue was there, the projection over a number of years that Long-Bailey was using. When we went to the general election itself, we
published the figures again in the cost.
Look at the Grey Book. Look at the Grey Book. That's what we published in the manifesto, and that's what we stand by. And those projections were made on the basis of figures coming from the government itself, the OBR, and the House of Commons Library.
True, but in 2 months you go from 70 billion to 23 billion.
The 70 billion was a projection over a number of years.
Yeah,
if you look at the Grey Book, that's what we went to the people on. That's what we stand by.
I want to
let me just say on the IFS, there may well have been differences in the IFS. And I'll just give you one example. Their example is that when you invest in the economy, they discount the multiplier effect. Virtually every other economist doesn't. They believe there will be a multiplier effect from the investment that we put in there. And in that way, you see, there are differences between economists about how you calculate this. We took the view, expressed to us by a large number of economists, that our figures not only were sound, but were conservative estimates.
OK, but just on borrowing to invest, I mean, you're talking about a fiscal multiplier of 1 to 1. You say it essentially pays for itself.
It depends on the individual scheme.
But in general, you have argued that the scheme pays for itself. Interest rates are low at the moment. You spend now, you reap the benefits. Now that makes sense according to kind of generally received economic wisdom in circumstances where you're emerging from recession, where interest rates are anchored close to zero. I mean, that's where you see 1 to 1 or even 2 to 1. Actually, we're close to full employment. Global monetary policy is tightening at the moment. Financial sector is lending again. A large fiscal stimulus of the type that you're talking about is far more likely to feed into higher inflation.
Well, let's go to the capital investment fund that we put forward. We suggested a programme of 250 billion investment by the state over a 10-year programme. Again, nothing untoward what's been seen in the past. It depends on the individual schemes that you invested in from which you get the return. I'll give you the example of one scheme. Crossrail for the North, 10 billion. Calculated, not by us, but independently, that would gain something like 90 billion investment in that region. That's the sort of investment we're going for. Investment wisely chosen that get a return, pay for themselves in the long run, but stimulate the economy and distribute resources around the
your plan to get rid of the deficit on day-to-day by the end of the 5 year, by the end of 5 years. And what's the plan for debt?
What we're saying is the debt to GDP ratio, which is the important one, that tells you whether you can pay for it, will be down within the life of a parliament.
We take all of these things.
But
and
that was tested by the IFS. Just a minute. You quoted the IFS.
I didn't challenge you on that point.
No, let me tell you, that was tested by the...
That point.
That was tested by the IFS, and the IFS found that
I just want to put something to you. I mean, on corporation tax, you can argue against it, but the view of many people is, it works in principle, but unfortunately there will be behavioural changes. A similar situation with income tax. I mean, nationalisation.
But that's why we put. Let me just address that assertion you made. That's why we've addressed behavioural changes within the programme that we put forward, both in terms of tax avoidance and evasion, and also a buffer of a significant sum in that programme.
Not to the scale that would be required to make the books balance.
With the greatest respect, other economists believe it was.
Okay, and plenty of others don't.
Including Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner. What more do you want from that?
Well, I don't have a Nobel Prize, so I'm not going to be challenging him directly. Look, nationalisation, though. Yeah, indeed. Nationalisation. Now, you've bristled when you've been asked this question in the past. Why isn't there a figure being put on it? We all understand that the figure will shift depending on the share price and other factors. But why don't you just tell us how much it would cost right now?
Because the debate is about whether or not it is cost effective. And you know as well as I do, as soon as any figure is bandied about, you lose that debate.
We've talked of nothing else this morning but figures. Your party continually bangs on about the fact that your manifesto was the only fully costed one. There's a big hole in it when it comes to nationalisation.
No, there isn't a big hole in it. The debate around when you acquire an asset, that is a valued asset, it pays for itself because it is an earning asset that therefore covers the cost of nationalisation itself. So, for example, let's take rail. We're saying on rail that we will renationalise it on the basis of when the franchises end, so it's cost effective. When East Coast Line was brought into the public sector and managed efficiently, it paid into the Treasury $1 billion. The government's now having to bail out the East Coast Line again at a cost most probably of $2 billion. What we're saying is bring it into public ownership. It'll be managed more effectively. It will pay for itself.
Wasn't it British Rail that missed the boat on electrification and also wielded the Beeching Act?
Greatest respect, past research has demonstrated the lack of investment in British Rail, but actually it was operating as effectively as it could with that level of investment.
My point is, nationalisation does not mean that poor business decisions will not be taken.
Well, with the greatest respect, if you look at the East Coast Line...
There's an awful lot of respect
yeah, there is. You need to respect my views as well, which is, one, when you look at the examples in rail where it's been brought back into public operation, both in East Coast Line and Connex was the last one in the South East, the most efficient services provided within our railway system. And
all I'm asking for is a figure. All I'm asking for is how much would it cost today to do what you're proposing at some point?
It would be cost-free because it pays for itself.
It's still a commitment in terms of government spending, isn't it?
Yes, but you get an income from the operation of the service.
Presuming that it runs well. All I'm asking for is a figure on how much it would cost.
I'm giving you the example of East Coast Line. Here's a concrete example. It's been brought back into public ownership. It's operated effectively, paid money into the Treasury. It gets reprivatised, and then what happens? We're left with possibly a £2 billion bill. So that demonstrates how effective it could be.
In terms of public sector pay, again, something which you've identified as something which resonates with the public, and it does clearly. I mean, you've long maintained that the public sector pay cap needs lifting. How much is that going to cost?
We've costed it within the thing. We looked at the costs against the OBR figures, and we've said that it will rise with the level above inflation of those costings that the OBR have said, and we put that in the Grey Book itself. Again, what we're also saying is that will be subject to negotiations. We're not going to interfere in those negotiations, but the most important thing is to lift the pay cap.
But in essence, you are committing right now to a real terms pay increase across the public sector.
We costed it in our Grey Book manifesto commitments. What we said was we took the OBR figures on what would be the rate of increase within the economy overall of wages. We costed that, and we said if you lift the pay cap, that would be the cost. However, that's subject to negotiation.
On deficit reduction, I have to admit, I've got a bit of confusion in terms of what the policy is. I mean, you said, yeah, absolutely, right. Eliminate the day-to-day deficit spend by the end of 5 years. But you'll be inheriting a day-to-day deficit, won't you? On current figures, we estimate, and this is around about £20-25 billion.
Possibly more.
Now, that's on possibly more. Now, that's on top of the £50 billion of additional tax rises that you're putting into place.
But just a minute, the 48.6 pay for themselves. The tax rises come in, they'll pay for the public services, so that's cost neutral. When you come to the deficit itself, what we're saying is we will not borrow for day-to-day expenditure, but what we will do is ensure that we borrow for investment overall, and that investment will cover its own cost because the rate of investment will give us a return on that investment. So therefore, we believe over a 5-year rolling programme, we'll be able to bring that deficit down. How do you do it? You do what this government doesn't do. You invest in the economy, you grow the economy, and in that way the debt to GDP ratio comes down.
I mean, I return to the point I made a few minutes ago. I mean, the idea that massive fiscal stimulus at this point in our economic cycle is going to be paid for by itself just doesn't stack up with the economists that have looked at situations in the past. I
think you're confusing two things. One is on day-to-day expenditure. We will ensure we do not borrow, full stop. Any day-to-day expenditure will be covered by the tax increases we've brought about, which is largely on corporations and the rich and the top 5%.
Again, no one seems to think that they will raise the amount that you claim that they will.
Look, you've just said it again. No one says to think. One organisation queried one element of our overall items. 130 and others, economists, supported it. So what I'm saying to you out there, and this isn't just me, IMF and other OECD are now saying you've got to invest now. If we don't invest, we'll have the same productivity crisis that we're facing at the moment. That's why this government has failed.
Is capitalism inherently wrong? Or are you just the man to fix it?
No, what we want to do is transform the economic model that we've got at the moment. And the economic model at the moment is too short-term, does not distribute the resources and the benefits fairly, and at the same time is too based regionally in the London and the South East. What we're trying to say is you take a long-term view and invest. You make sure that investment goes all over the country and no one is left behind, no area is left behind. And then when we build a prosperous, economically and environmentally sustainable economy, those rewards, that prosperity is shared by everybody.
So you're the man to fix capitalism?
We're the party that will go into government with the policies that will transform our economy so that everyone gains. And as I say, we have an economically and environmentally sustainable economy. That prosperity has got to be shared by every person in every region rather than, well, some of the wealthiest at the moment, the way it is at the moment.
See, I don't know why you didn't take the opportunity to claim the Mr. Fix-It title. It certainly sounds a bit better than Spreadsheet Phil, doesn't it? But anyway.
The title that I want is the person who actually brought common sense to the way we manage our economy, the way in which we look to the long term, the way we share all the resources around people fairly so we all gain from the prosperity of the investment we put in. And that we tackle, I have to say also, we tackle some of the appalling treatment of some of our fellow citizens in terms of homelessness, housing, education cuts, the NHS crisis that we've got.
Well, you may very well have that opportunity before too long. Mr. McDonnell, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.